Fire Emblem sets itself apart from other mainstream strategy games which often use generic unit types for gameplay by instead having cool little fellas that you can get invested in and buy merchandise of. However, while moving little characters around on a grid has been a thing since the first Fire Emblem, why you move them around on that grid has changed drastically in ways that I think are very interesting. To help track the progress of our journey, we'll be mostly following the progression of the green and red fellows that join you at the start of most of your adventures, and how they've all been designed within the context of their games. Fire Emblem 1 is a game that heavily focuses on the permanent death aspect of the series. As explained by series creator Shozo Kaga, he didn't really want it to be a big deal if any of your characters died. One aspect of this is that most of the characters in FE1 are extremely generic. This was before the advent of supports and skills, so if two units are in the same class, they can generally do the same things. So, checking in on our first red and green fellows, Cain and Abel, they're both Cavaliers with extremely similar stats. And if somehow you're bad enough at Fire Emblem to have both of them die in the first 3 chapters, guess what? Now you have Mathis, Hardin, Roshea, and Violen to play with. The general logic applies to most of the cast. Gordon dies, use George or Tomas. Julian dies, use Rickard. Doga dies. Now that's not to say that there aren't unique units. For example, only Lena can use the Hammern Staff. However, it's pretty easy to see that the unit design in the first game is meant to work hand in hand with the permanent death mechanics of the game, allowing each player to experience a unique story that's more rewarding based on how invested the player is in the lives and deaths of their units. And now for something completely different. To be frank, Fire Emblem Gaiden is a complete outlier in the otherwise pretty linear development of unit design. Each army only gets 16 units compared to Blade of Light's 50, and you can deploy all of the units you have in any given map, meaning that if you lose one unit, you're at a permanent disadvantage and that unit slot is completely irreplaceable. So, how does this mesh with the permanent death mechanic? Well, it doesn't, so they made it so you can undie your units should anything happen to them. As for our red and green fellows, Gray and Cliff, they start out as villagers and you can actually choose their class, something that wouldn't be seen again in the series for a long time. So the units you get in this game are designed more with growth in mind, where the player gets attached to the initial group while they're scrubby villagers, and then the player gets to see a satisfying zero to hero journey as they become adept in whatever class you make them, which, while fun, doesn't really fit in with the next several games we'll be covering. It is, however, a good indicator of how things will turn out in the very far-off future. Everything I said about Fire Emblem 1 applies to Fire Emblem 3, as Fire Emblem 3 is a remake of Fire Emblem 1 with a sequel story included. Fire Emblem 4 is where things start to get a bit more interesting. Units now have skills, making each one a bit more unique. For example, our red and green fellows are once again Cavaliers. However, unlike Cain and Abel, who have no meaningful differences, Alec can attack enemies twice and disable enemy skills, and Noish can sometimes get critical hits and sometimes attack twice. Wow! One of these is obviously better than the other, but that's besides the point. However, Fire Emblem 4 is a game that ties its story heavily into its gameplay. For example, a couple of your playable characters have signature story-important weapons that boost their stats much higher than what the enemies could possibly hope to match, enabling you to beat most of the game only ever using 2 or 3 units with extreme ease, maybe even 1 if you're feeling spicy. So while it's like Gaiden, where you can deploy all of the units in your army in any given mission, this is often extremely tedious and not needed. So while each individual unit is slightly more interesting, it's still not really a big deal if Noish finds himself 6 feet under. And while there is a second generation that you can influence depending on who you pair together in the first, unlike future games in the series, Fire Emblem 4 will supply you with replacement children in place of the ones you would have gotten normally. Even then, Fire Emblem 4 doesn't really want you to focus on the permanent death aspect of the series, as the game allows you to save at the start of each turn. So I'd say that the units in this game were designed to tell the very specific story that Kaga wanted to tell, compared to earlier entries which relied on the player crafting their own narrative depending on how they used their units. There is a very big part of the story that pretty much cements this point, but unlike the rest of the Fire Emblem community, I will not spoil it for you in case you haven't played Genealogy yet. If you know, you know. Thracia is the game that's the most similar to the first game. About 24 main missions, a lot of playable characters, limited deployment slots, and weapons that don't do this, so you're actually encouraged to think about who you use. This is also the game where the design of the units starts getting really, really fun. For example, the green fellow you start with, Ocean, has an axe that only he can use that has high crit and the ability to attack from a distance, and the skill Wrath, which in Thracia lets you crit whenever an enemy attacks first. Combine this with his axe that can attack at a distance and you have a unit that can clean house on enemy phase, which is very fun. Your red-ish fellow can acquire a Brave Axe very early on, and use his Vantage skill, which doesn't have an HP requirement in this game, to completely clean house on enemy phase 2. Compare these two to our previous examples, and you can see a real uptick in quality here. This also applies to the cast of Thracia in general, with a ton of side characters that have unique weapons are things that only they can do, and those things are often very fun. Tina is one of my favorite Fire Emblem characters of all time, just for her ability to steal anything and everything. Even the garbage characters have something to do, like how Shanam is terrible in combat, but can buy items at half price. However, due to there being nearly 50 playable characters, much like Fire Emblem 1, you can play pretty liberally when it comes to unit deaths. The units you get later in the game don't serve as direct replacements like in FE1 though. If Makuya dies, it's not like you can just replace her with Trude, since Makuya has Vantage and True has Nihil, making them unique, compared to replacing Abel with Violin where there's not much going on there. So I think the purpose of units in Thracia is an evolution of Fire Emblem 1's philosophy, where you can get invested in the lives and deaths of your units, and you're still not hindered much if a couple of them end up croaking. However, almost every unit has their own unique gameplay quirk, allowing you to get more attached if you do end up enjoying some unit's particular gimmick, which of course meshes well with the permadeath system, since you feel a slightly bigger gut punch when a unit you like dies, and it increases tension, since if a unit dies, they'll have to figure out how to clear maps without the unique abilities they brought to the table, which, in my opinion, greatly increases immersion and fun strategic thinking. Binding Blade would remove skills, making each unit's gameplay less distinct, but it's still generally similar to how Thracia and FE1 handle it. There's a lot of playable units, and if some of them happen to die along the way, you can just deploy somebody of the same class in their place. For example, if you happen to lose your red and green fellows, Alan and Lance, you can just deploy Rekka and Noah in their place without too much of a difference. However, Binding Blade would add something to units that would change the course of the series forever, by turning the units into actual characters. Binding Blade added the support system, meaning that we could learn about each individual character's backstory, their hobbies, and things like that. For example, through his supports, we can learn that our local starting green fellow Lance enjoys chess, is very concerned about Roy's safety, is a very big reader, and so on. Compare this to Alec, who says something once at the beginning of the game, and then is tossed into the eternal void. Or Abel, who says nothing at all. While supports do have minor effects on gameplay in this game, I think their effect on the actual players would have a much bigger impact. What I mean by this is, do you think you'll care more if a unit who doesn't really have a character and doesn't really do anything at all dies? Or will you care more if Gonzalez, the lovable giant who loves getting flowers for his friends, dies? This can of course lead to less players wanting to engage with the permanent death mechanics of the series, since of course they'd get more attached to their characters. I'm not saying the addition of supports is a bad thing, many of my favorite characters wouldn't be my favorites without their supports, but it still changes how players are willing to engage with one of the series' core mechanics. So while I think Binding Blade units were designed to generally serve the same purpose as Fire Emblem 1 units, the consequences of supports may have been far more reaching than the developers intended. The next 4 Fire Emblem games would generally follow Binding Blade's template. A lot of playable characters with a lot of supports or base conversations, but not too terrible if you lose somebody along the way. However, Path of Radiance did reintroduce visible skills. Shadow Dragon: A New Mystery are remakes of Fire Emblem 1 and Fire Emblem 3, so almost everything I said about those games applies to these too. However, the units are even more generic and replaceable since you can freely reclass to fill any role a previously alive unit may have filled. A New Mystery has this many units, so it's very easy to engage with the permadeath mechanic since it's essentially impossible to run out of characters unless you're actively trying to fail. And even if you do somehow run out, the game just chucks generic units at you anyway. So for the first 12 games in the series, we went from easily replaceable units to irreplaceable units but their deaths didn't really matter because you could just revive them, to the deaths of your units not mattering at all because you could just use Seliph Rs and whoever wound up with Forseti, to the next 8 games having generally more interesting characters, be it from skills or supports, resulting in more impactful situations occurring within the system of permadeath. We can see that things were generally consistent in their progression outside of a weird NES game and a weird SNES game. However, the next couple of games would change the purpose of units completely. Before we get into all that though, remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. I already got 5,000 points! Sorry. So hey, maybe I'll get to 50,000 eventually. It also helps the video spread, yada yada, you know the deal. Also, if you're subscribed, you'll get to see a similar video I'm making about these cute little elemental animals later that has the same video topic as this one, that'll come out later. Also, if you feel so inclined, you can support my Patreon to support the channel and an independent SRPG I'm making where I am, in fact, designing units. Wow! Thanks again to Ginger and DS Coda for supporting the channel. With all that out of the way, let's get back to your regularly scheduled programming. The first 12 Fire Emblems were designed with the idea that you could lose units in mind, so you were never actively losing out on anything. There are some small exceptions to this, like Sarah being the only one who can revive Ivil, and bonus missions in Binding Blade being locked behind certain characters still being alive. Awakening, however, completely changes this dynamic. Let's check in on our local red and green fellows. Sully and Stahl are your typical early game cavaliers, but if they die you can just replace them with... Yup, Sully and Stahl are the only two cavaliers you get in the game, so not only would you have to reclass other units to replace their role in the army, you would also lose out on Sully's kid, who would be your replacement for Kellum if he ended up dying. The same is true for Fates, except you lose even more by letting units die in Fates. In Fates, if you get 2 units to their maximum support rank, they unlock each other's classes as reclass options. So for example, if Rinka died, you would have no other way to turn Charlotte into an Oni, if that's something you wanted to do. Fates also gave each unit a unique personal skill, making them even more irreplaceable. Fates also has the breeding system, so if a unit dies, you're missing out on their kid and that kid's recruitment map, which could have many great items on it. You lose so much just by losing a single unit in these 2 games that losing just 1 unit can be considered a loss condition by many players, leading to a reset. The units themselves are also more suited for long-term investment. With the 3DS games having so many skill slots and so many potential reclass options, you can make the same unit completely different from run to run. However, making a unit how you want them to be in these games requires so much specific time and care that if you lost them, it would mean that you completely wasted your time. Compare this to a unit like Rutger. Yeah, Rutger is good, but besides leveling him up, you didn't really do anything in particular to make him good. Just using him casually without any additional planning is enough, really, and losing him doesn't immediately screw over your entire run. Now, I'm not saying this is a bad thing. I love building units in Conquest, and have even made some videos about specific builds that I enjoy using. I even enjoyed the new interactions with permadeath, because making specific unit builds to perfectly overcome what Conquest throws at me is part of the extreme fun and challenge of Conquest for me. It's not bad, it's just a different type of challenge. However, not everybody enjoys challenges with extreme stakes, so some changes needed to be made to the game itself since units had changed so much by this point. So while casual mode was introduced in Fire Emblem 12, it became actually useful and a well-known feature in Awakening, since 12 actually supports traditional permadeath, and Awakening actually came out in places that aren't Japan, allowing players to enjoy the story, supports, and unit building without having to worry about strategy all that much. Why you would ever play either of these games for just the story is beyond me, but hey, more power to you, I guess. However, while permadeath is extremely punishing in these titles, you can still kinda get away with it. I've had runs in Conquest where 1 or 2 units died and I was able to recover, albeit with extreme difficulty, and if you're experienced enough you can definitely get away with an Iron Man. So I'd say the purpose of units in the 3DS games is to be a conduit for your creativity and unit building skills that turn into fun long-term projects, that also provide compelling fail conditions for the maps themselves. The next original game in the series, though, would dial up the punishment for losing units to the absolute limit. Before that, though, we should talk about Echoes. Echoes is a remake of Gaiden, so everything I said for that game applies here too, but they added a turn rewind mechanic in this game, so you don't even have to worry about visiting the revival fountains or resetting the level. This rewind mechanic would later become a mainstay for the series. Speaking of later in the series, the units in Fire Emblem Three Houses are like your Gaiden starting party taken to the extreme. They all start off in the same class, and you're completely free to choose their path from beginning to end, making each one of your units a 40-hour investment. You also can't get any additional units after the halfway point in the game, and you only ever get about 10 units unless you hound units from other houses before the halfway point, so if you lose any of them, you're completely boned. The devs knew this, however, which is likely why the rewind mechanic from Echoes came back. The purpose of units in this game is 100% to facilitate the game's story and world. Each unit has a backstory that's either intertwined with another character's or is important to the lore of the world. Ash's father is one of the first bosses of the game. Lysithea was experimented on by the same people as Edelgard, and therefore is able to inform Cloud about them in the Golden Deer story. Mercedes and Jaruch's story shows how vile the people of this world can be about genetics. And I could go on. If you removed just one of these characters from the game, it would be completely different, compared to Fates, where if you tossed somebody like Nyx out of the picture, not much would change. This approach led to many more people getting invested in these characters than your typical Fire Emblem game, and many of them are still discussed to this day, years after the game came out. And while I certainly have my favorite from Three Houses, These days, I kinda think it's too much of a divorce from what I expect from Fire Emblem gameplay. So while I enjoy the story and world of Three Houses, having one unit die essentially end my run is kind of annoying. So now when I play the game, I only use one unit to avoid that problem. Work smarter, not harder. Engage, however, is a bit of a return to form. You get plenty of units, evenly spaced across the whole adventure, you can reclass them into pretty much any class with minimal effort like in Shadow Dragon, almost none of them are relevant to the story unlike Three Houses, and the strongest abilities in the game are tied to items that you can put on any character, so you're never set back too much by a death. It's completely viable to do an Iron Man, and many players have already done so. There are even some post-map interactions depending on who's currently dead in your army, which is pretty neat. Although many players had a harder time getting attached to these characters due to the general decrease in value they contribute to the world, and it being harder in general to unlock supports in the vanilla version of the game, which is sadly the version most players played. If you only care about gameplay though, that shouldn't matter much. In general, I'd say units in Engage serve the same purposes they do in a game like Thracia. So there we have it, the evolution of unit design in Fire Emblem. Like I said in the beginning, the purpose of a unit from game to game can be drastically different, and I think it goes to show how interesting a series Fire Emblem can be, with how much it drastically changes between entries. What do I think is the best though? Well, I think a combination of Thracia and Binding Blade would be ideal. I think you should get plenty of units, each with skills or unique weapons that make them fun to use, but nothing that would screw you over if you had to go without. I also think having side conversations that reveal their personality and place in the world without being too present that they need to provide their 2 cents for every cutscene is ideal. I'm looking at you, Ignatz. You're my baby boy, but please, please, shut up. But enough about me. What do you think the ideal design for units in Fire Emblem is? Let me know in the comments down below. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed. More importantly though, I'd like to thank DS Coda and Ginger for supporting my channel and my game. And sorry for not uploading in like, I think my last actual video that wasn't the Fates. Get all the units thing was like Mathis in January, which was 4 months ago. My dog got terminally ill and then it died, so I've been a little demotivated from everything, especially making YouTube videos. But the next video probably shouldn't be as long as of a wait. And most importantly, remember to have a nice day. Bye-bye.